enemies are not 7,000 miles from home. They sit in boardrooms. They are CEOs. They are bankers. They are hedge fund managers. They do not live 7,000 miles from home. Our enemies are right here, and we look at them every day. Mama, don't you cry. Mama, don't you cry. Your little boy ain't gonna die. Little boy ain't gonna die. Mama, don't you cry. Mama, don't you cry.
My name is Christopher May. I left the Army as a conscientious objector. We were told that these medals represented, democracy and justice and hope and change for the world. These medals represent a failure on behalf of the leaders of NATO to accurately represent the will of their own people. It represents a failure on the leaders of NATO to do what's right by the disenfranchised people of this world.
Power is always illegitimate until it proves itself legitimate, and the burden of proof doesn't fall on the people to prove that a government is illegitimate. The burden of proof is always on the people that hold those powers.
The Chicago Tribune building, a 36-story castle on the Chicago River complete with a tower and Gothic gargoyles, serves a symbolic purpose of explaining our actuality. That is, how the establishment press is failing America by not living up to the intended social responsibilities of journalism in our democracy. For months, in an exaggerated preoccupation with inconvenience, these pillars of self-respecting journalism work to marginalize the protest voices of thousands, embracing a pretext of fear and safety at the expense of expressions of freedom and American civil liberty. The consensus being formed by the news media is that the Chicago police should be honored for the handling of the NATO Summit. Virtually none of the anchors, hosts, or reporters in mainstream media are talking about the police riot, the brutality, harassment, intimidation, and preemptive policing carried out by the Chicago Police Department and other security forces to suppress speech and restrict assembly. There is no coincidence that the NATO Summit and the G8 Summit that preceded it reflects a system not set up to spread wealth but to preserve and protect it, not to relieve chaos but to contain and punish it. NATO is not an impartial arbiter in this state of affairs, but the military wing of a political and economic project that makes it possible. Neoliberal globalization and the inequalities that come with it cannot exist without force or the threat of it. The hidden hand of the market will never work without a hidden fist. When Rahm Emanuel brought the summit to Chicago, he boasted, "From a city perspective, this will be an opportunity to showcase what is great about the greatest city in the greatest country." The paradox inherent in hosting a summit like this exposes the brutal nature in which inequality and wealth are maintained at a global level. On the other hand, it became a missed opportunity for journalists to fulfill their function in democracy by explaining to Americans how those inequalities are replicated locally.
Well, I'm reminded of a story of Benjamin Franklin leaving the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. It was a closed process. The public was not invited in. There were armed guards at the door. And when the proceedings are over, Franklin exits the Constitutional Convention, and a woman hurriedly comes up to him and says, "Well, Dr. Franklin, what do we have, a democracy or a monarchy?" And he says, "It's a republic if you can keep it." Well, that implied that citizens had a responsibility to insist that government leaders perform their function in support of creating a more civil society. The role of the press in doing this? The press has a constitutional imprimatur, an obligation to serve citizens with news they need to know that makes democracy and self-governance possible. That's the one and only and exclusive reason why we have the First Amendment protection to keep the government off our back. Not just to make money, but to serve citizens with news they need to know that becomes the basis for moving forward into social justice.
You can feel the disconnect between the average person and the political leader. And I don't think that that's anything new in American culture. I think that there is a huge disconnect in terms of what they both view as priorities and the decision making that goes on. And there is a certain lack of communication, especially within media outlets that are supposed to offer some sort of freedom of expression.
And because so many of the people that make a living in the press do not take their social responsibility seriously, but instead you have this war between serving citizens with news they need to know and this war of making money. And when you get an argument about covering the news, which doesn't ask, why is it news, but instead, why aren't we doing the same story that somebody else is doing? It seems like they're getting a lot of page views. When you get a marketing strategy to what the news is, then the press, instead of serving citizens with news they need to know, just becomes another profit center.
The ability to engage in the political sphere is seen as a very exclusive group of people. And I think that it's really hard for the average person to understand how politics operates.
My view is the democracy we get is the democracy we demand. So in the final analysis, the press has an important role to play, but even more importantly, it's the public that must demand that the press serve it in ways that make democracy, self-governance, republicanism more possible.
That freedom of expression, especially, we've been seeing the debate about the internet and stuff like that, but freedom of expression is really critical in terms of making progress.
I think in China we practice ourselves, we exercise our self-governance by electing our local representative.
I support social and economic justice in the world today.
Yes, I support social and economic justice throughout the world, definitely.
I support social and economic justice in this world.
I also support social and economic justice in this world.
I do also support social and economic justice in this world.
Generally support social and economic justice in this world.
Once upon a time, when major news events were chronicled strictly by professional journalists, broadcast on television, or printed in newspapers by the few for the masses, protesters were prime makers of history. In the 1960s, American protesters marched for civil rights and against the Vietnam War. In the 70s, they rose up in Iran and Portugal. In the 80s, they spoke out against nuclear weapons in the US and Europe, against Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, against tyranny in Tiananmen Square in Eastern Europe. Protesters took to the streets without weapons to declare they were opposed. It was a natural continuation of politics by other means, vivid, important, and consequential. In the 2 decades since the 1980s, we've experienced the greatest rise in living standards the world has ever known. Credit was easy. Complacency and apathy were rife, and street protests looked like pointless emotional sideshows. Demonstrations in this rich world seem ineffectual, obsolete, and irrelevant. Radical critiques and protests against the system for young people were mostly confined to pop culture fantasy of brave rebels fighting oppressors. Massive and effective street protests have become a global oxymoron until, shockingly and without anticipation, it became the definition of our times. The protester has again become a maker of history.
For those of us who have a memory of the 1960s and protests at the Democratic National Convention, when people took protesting seriously because they were people, say, from the ages of 18 and 29. They knew if they were going to be taken up in the draft and had to serve in Vietnam, it could be a matter of life and death. People took their civil unrest seriously. And really the protests of Occupy New York and Occupy Oakland, these have been almost trivial and benign and banal protests in comparison to the force, the momentum, the exuberance of what we saw in the 60s. It's probably because most of the people watching documentaries like this are so young, they have no historical recollection of a fact that not only was our country born in protest, at various times along the way protest has been unattractive, unflattering, sometimes violent, but individuals expressing their First Amendment concerns, and it's had overall a very constructive role in keeping political leaders on call. Political leaders and leadership work for the people. We don't work for them.
The more people the more people are involved in a cause tends to increase the amount of visibility that it has within the political realm. If there were some way for the protesters to connect to the actual people instead of just being able to stand outside, and I think that would have been a really great opportunity.
As an ethnographer, one who studies the actual engagement of people in everyday activities and in political activities, you also want to know the human stories. You want to know the motivations. You want to know the very particular and specific interests that people have in political activities, I would think.
My name is Chisato, and I support economic and social justice.
I really support economic justice.
Do you support social and economic justice in the world?
Oh yes, I do.
I'm Verto Maestro, and I do agree, social justice, economic justice for everyone is the right way to be.
I support economic and social justice.
There is a long, proud American tradition of talking with our feet. In this country, when there is strong disagreement with the actions of the government, the people protest. Today, NATO advisors and our president seem intent upon preparing for military solutions to solve world problems. This has stirred strong feelings of deep opposition. In a city with a long history of protest, Chicago Mayor Emanuel's over-the-top paramilitary police presence during the NATO Summit protest served to intimidate the lawful expression of government dissent and signals a continuing war on civil liberty, diminishing the Constitution. Worse, our establishment media passively accepted the policies of an administration that continues to invoke the politics of fear to stifle the dissent of students, occupiers, immigrants, and the American working class.
The way that I saw it was that for the protests, it wasn't a theme against the backlash of police authority. It was more a critique on the actions of the government and some of the policies that it was taking.
If in fact there was a lot of protest, and the protest seemed to sort of usurp the purpose and mission of the G8 and of NATO, it would also probably lend itself to the narrative that Obama may be in over his head.
I saw two groups of medias, two big groups of medias. One group was at the front of the protesters group. The other group was before the group of Black Bloc.
We both have the censorship.
You can see it as suppression of a certain kind of protest. You can see it as an attempt to lower the temperature, if you will, of the protest. There's no question that was, I think, an intention.
There will be some time that our website will be blocked for no reason, so people have to guess. So for what we got blocked over here.
I support justice for all people. Even-handed justice must prevail for all people.
I support social and economic justice around the world.
Absolutely. It's probably one of the most important things that has motivated me to be an academic.
On May 20th, 2012, thousands of people took to the streets of Chicago to peacefully protest U.S. acts of military and economic aggression. and to challenge the corporate and financial powers that wage war, ravage the environment and the economy while trampling upon our democratic rights and liberties. The NATO Summit protests in Chicago were deeply marred. They were marred by the exploitive use of black, brown, and women law enforcement at the launch of the march as an establishment photo opportunity. It was marred by the difficulty obtaining and limited granting of march permits. It was marred by the use of metal barricades to form closed areas into which protesters were confined, limiting their freedom and ability to move around. It was marred by the severely restricted access to the rally site. It was marred by the overwhelming paramilitary presence intended to suppress peaceful expressions of dissent and distance the protesters from the sight of world leaders and the international press. And it was marred by the unwarranted and illegitimate use of police force to clear peaceful demonstrators from the streets and sidewalks at the conclusion of the rally.
The police the surrounding to the protester and the restriction about the roads or something, I think it's pretty familiar for me, especially the police. The scene is familiar, just change to American. It's not Chinese.
This weekend showed us a form of military, if you want to call it military or policing activity that was there very clearly to suppress the kind of protest that they felt would be potentially outrageous in a way, from their perspective, outrageous.
I think that people can see the police as a deterrent. There's definitely that aspect of it because they are seen as generally having more power than the citizens that they are in charge of.
There are too many police than I have thought, because I don't think we need that number of police to help us to maintain the safety too.
What I see in here and the people that were so impassioned to express their opinions and whatever is the support or disagreements with or frustrated with the government or not, and the passion and the way that people do this is maybe the way that I didn't see it before. So maybe I go back. Maybe I won't come up with the situation a lot in China, but I got the experience that I see this kind of things, and I know what the mainstream media have done with the coverage and what their shortage. Maybe their angles are not coverage all of the angles of the protesters. So I maybe correct my way to coverage this kind of story.
Well, I think leading up to the summit, there was a lot of people were very nervous about how it was going to be because of Seattle, because of the Democratic conventions in '68, and there was a lot of techniques that the police were thinking about using that were controversial.
But the police are trying to push them, so that's what I saw.
The police, just visually, were a very striking force to see, especially when you first arrived there, because there were so many of them and you had police in their riot gear. And
I think in terms of the police that were there, the extraordinary amount of police officers that were there, I think a lot of people just expect the worst out of people.
Support social and economic justice in the world.
I support economic justice.
Journalists also left an ugly stain on the NATO Summit in Chicago. The media's disproportionate focus on the number of protesters, concerns about the Chicago Police Department's response, and endless commentary about the violent propensities of protesters served only to discourage participation and interfere with commercial activity across the entire city. The disproportionate number of paramilitary police surrounding protesters and staged off-camera in every direction at the conclusion of the rally was deliberately not conveyed to the public and smacked of conspiratorial design to conceal the unnecessary public expenditure. The false portrayal of protesters as the aggressors at the conclusion of the rally by most mainstream media outlets is deserving of the label propaganda. Worse, in the days prior to the NATO Summit, reporters like the Tribune's Rex Huckey worked to stereotype the image of protesters as having smoked marijuana and likely incapable of making intelligent life choices, as evidenced by their vividly colored clothing and multiple body piercings, while marginalizing the legitimate issues of their dissent and mocking their strong belief that people should be nice to each other. In the event of confrontation or thoughtful dialogue, Huckey wrote, NATO troops will be to your location within moments to extract you and subdue these citizen enemies. Borrowing a phrase from protesters, this is what democracy looks like in actuality.
Actually, I think in China we need to practice or we need a better journalism. In China, the journalism is a kind of different from the one in America. But when that's what I think before I come to America. But when I come to America, I think the control or the censorship inside the journalism is not very different from in these two countries.
I'm the director of the graduate program in journalism at DePaul University. I was a working journalist for 11 years on both sides of the Atlantic. Part of that time was spent in Washington, D.C. Part of that time was spent as a Middle East section chief based in Jerusalem. And I've been teaching since 1988. I have a PhD in mass communication. I've written many books that focus on journalism, journalism history, and journalism ethics. It's never been more perilous to be a citizen, to be a member of the public, because never has so much been required of citizens. Instead of ABC, CBS, NBC, New York Times, Washington Post being the leading agenda setters, where 85% of all Americans got all or most of their news from those same sources, now we are awash in competing sources of information. And what it does is it requires not only more of our journalism, it requires even more of our citizens.
I think journalism is functioning the democracy by providing the information to the individuals or to the people that make them to engage in the self-governance.
Marilyn Levin. I'm from Boston, and I believe in social and economic justice for the world.
I do support social and economic justice in the world.
And Werner Lang, W-E-R-N-E-R Lang, L-A-N-G-E. I'm from Ohio with Ohio Prophetic Voices, and we support peace and justice around the world.
Okay, I support economic and social justice for all Americans and for all people.
At a time when more and more, not only Americans, but people of the world, I think, feel increasingly powerless because of the size of the military-industrial state, but at the same time empowered as a result of social media and other devices, which become a way strategically of bringing people together in community, whether it's in protest, particularly in the so-called Arab Spring, but also when NATO and G8 meet, it's a place where cameras go, and the hope by many of these protest organizations is they will elevate and create a more visual environment for their causes as a result of also participating.
I think that the social media is going to play a huge role in terms of how the average person can make their voices heard, and we've seen over the past couple of years the really radical transformation that has occurred because of social media and unconventional types of information sharing.
Yeah, I think social media it's revolutionized politics. I think it's revolutionized political collective action. We have the vote. We have the politics that is reflected in our normal political process. What we haven't had is that ability for individuals to directly engage with others dispersed throughout the country, the world in many ways.
Well, the democratization of information is a good thing. The Citizens United case and ones like it see now a digital landscape where the majority of Americans within the first 15 minutes of when they awaken in a day have handheld and portable devices delivering them news of the day and of the overnight. We've never had a population that is more connected to more sites. Unfortunately, we need ways of discriminating these initiatives of eloquence, separating wheat from chaff. And if the press doesn't do it for us, who will?
It gives people a way to simultaneously encourage discussion amongst themselves, whereas they wouldn't have been able to before, and also just to engage the government critically.
There also is this internationalization that has taken place, where a protest here can be seen halfway around the world, where a Chinese dissident reporting from a hospital can communicate directly to members of Congress who are then in session.
The social media play a very big role in China. Yes, they are more likely to believe that the news or information on the social media is true. More true than the news posted by the national press.
The biggest concern in Chicago was the very absence of a single defining image. There was no single movement or ideological agenda, no figurehead at the helm of the crowd. The main message emanating from the masses during the NATO Summit protests in Chicago was simply no. No to perpetual war. No to continued military spending at the expense of education and health care. No to the undermining of basic labor rights that many workers had either forgotten or taken for granted until threatened with extinction. No to the draconian pieces of legislation like the National Defense Authorization Act that threatens civil liberties, criminalizes constitutionally protected expressions of dissent, and eviscerates fundamental due process protections of Americans so that they can be held indefinitely without charge or trial. So the slogan, "This is what democracy looks like," had a ring both of pride and puzzlement. What could we divine from the look of democracy, from the faces of multiple political orientations, contrasted against an overwhelming coalition of armed law enforcement? What is really killing America in actuality? So the protests in Chicago and other communities like Oakland, Ohio, New York, and Quebec are beginning to blow some of the dust off the usable past of protesters by showing young people how economic security dovetails with social justice and human rights. At the intersection of these struggles is the college student that graduates with a lifetime of debt, and an economic prescription that leads young men and women into the military instead of public universities and sustainable employment. Nothing less than a squandering of human capital. Aided by the establishment press, our democracy is being silenced by a socially tone-deaf political system. While the voices of protest begin to harmonize into a single cry for justice, that is our freedom in actuality.